Hello, welcome folks. We'll be getting started in a minute or two. Hello, welcome folks. We'll be getting started in about a minute or two. If you could, in the meantime, introduce yourself, the organization you're with, and what state you live in. Welcome folks. We'll be getting started in about a minute or so. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat box. You can include your organization or affiliation and what state you live in. We're just letting a couple more folks in as they trickle their way into Zoom, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. Happy Monday, everyone. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started as more folks trickle in. Hello and welcome everyone. If you haven't already, please include your name in the chat box, your organization or affiliation, and the state that you live in. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nita Sumik and I'm the National Field Manager for We Are All America. We Are All America is a national campaign. If you don't know about us, we work to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcome those who are seeking protection and freedom and safety in the United States. We organize people across the country, across religious and cultural differences to build inclusive communities where we all belong. Today's webinar is in partnership with Refugee Council USA, National Partnership for New Americans, Amnesty International USA, and Church World Service. And today's topic will cover federal policy priorities for Congress this year. Our speakers will provide an update about advocating for federal funding to support refugees and immigrants for federal fiscal year 2024. And also we will be discussing ways you can be engaged in upcoming Refugee Council Advocacy Days that will be happening May 1st through May 3rd, and other ways that you can take action and be engaged. Now, before I begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please be advised that this webinar will be recorded and shared among our networks. If you have questions, we will have someone monitoring the chat box, so you may type your questions anytime throughout the webinar in the chat box. We will also have a Q&A time at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome my first guest, Diego Lopez, who is the Deputy Director of Policy and Campaigns with the National Partnership for New Americans. So Diego, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Neda. Hi, everyone. This is Diego Inigas Lopez, he, him pronouns for MPNA, and glad to be here with you all today to discuss some of the appropriations priorities of the MPNA network. And I'll start off by listing them very briefly. The first is to increase funding for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Citizenship and Integration Grant Program, which provides grants to community-based organizations, cities, and other entities that offer naturalization and English instruction classes. The second appropriations priority that the network has is funding for backlog reduction at USCIS. So MPNA for several years has been involved in leading campaigns and efforts to reduce USCIS backlogs. We've seen the current administration reduce the naturalization backlog by over half. But nevertheless, there are still hundreds of thousands of people in that backlog, and backlogs for other immigration applications remain a serious issue. The third appropriations priority that we have is funds for legal representation for people who are facing deportation or removal. And there's currently over 1 million people facing deportation in immigration court. There are many more asylum seekers and other migrants facing deportation in proceedings outside of immigration court, and too many of them face that without legal counsel, despite the fact that when someone has legal counsel, their chances of obtaining humanitarian or immigration relief increase exponentially. So that's a third priority for us in appropriations, as well as outside of appropriations. And then the fourth appropriations priority is increasing humanitarian relief for asylum seekers and other migrants through FEMA funds. And this became an even more important issue for the MPNA network when members within our network last year began rapid response after Republican governors started flying or busing different migrants to cities like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and others as part of a political ploy. So those are our four appropriations priorities. If we can go to the next slide, please. In an attempt to demystify this somewhat dense process, I'd like to talk about just some key dates and then ways in which the MPNA network has weighed in or engaged in this appropriations process, which is just, Congress passing a bill to fund different functions of the federal government. So late last year, early this year, we identified the appropriations priorities, which I just mentioned. And then earlier in this year, we started joining working groups that would draft the language that we're proposing for Congress to pass. So we did that in the first 2 months or so of this year. And what we've begun doing in late February and in this month has been to submit that proposed language to different key appropriators offices. It's a very wonky, dense process of going through different portals and emailing different offices with our appropriations priorities, but it's one way of advancing our objectives. At the same time, we began to identify different congressional champions and ask them to draft a letter, or we draft a letter for them asking for the same request that we're making, and then distribute it to different offices to show more and more support for that priority. So identifying congressional champions, drafting their letters, and now circulating those letters are one way in which the MPNA organization and network have engaged in this process. And then basically between now and May, we're going to be meeting with appropriators. Typically, the House releases a budget draft May, June, sometimes earlier. So we want to meet with as many key appropriators offices between now and then and ask them to make sure and to advocate so that our priorities are involved in what they ultimately release in May or June. Then later on, the Senate would release its budget bill, typically around June or July. And between the House and the Senate bill, budget draft bill, we're going to continue to meet with these different key appropriators offices. And then some other key tactics might include organizational letters, showing a broad array of support from community-based organizations, from nonprofits, immigrant rights groups, and others for these appropriations priorities. And then September 30th is the deadline for passing the budget, though we've seen in many years they do continuing resolution, which is funding the government at levels that they've previously funded it last year. And then we know that there's also a major current battle between whether to pass a budget, or now Republicans want, or at least some Republicans want to demand some concessions from the president, from Democrats, in order to do that. So that's something that might delay or complicate this process right here. So going on to the next slide, please. One of the reasons why MPNA has been involved in this process, if we can go to the next slide, please, is because we have found that we are able to advance certain legislative proposals that we wouldn't otherwise outside of the appropriations process. So late last week, we worked with Congresswoman Ming and Senator Markey to reintroduce a bill that's called the New Deal for New Americans Act, which was originally proposed and introduced in 2019. And this bill would create a National Office of New Americans. It would expand access to citizenship, fund programs for community-based organizations who offer immigration legal services, workforce development, and English services, and then set a minimum amount of refugees that the United States has to resettle annually at 125,000 people. And we have found that through the appropriations process, we've been able to advance some of the proposals in this act. So for example, when we originally introduced the New Deal, the proposal was to increase the USCIS Citizenship and Immigration Grant Program to $25 million. In the last 2 fiscal years, we've been able to achieve that. So in 2022, we increased it to 20 million. And then we were successful in getting Congress to increase that funding to 25 million in the last fiscal year. So now when the congressional champions reintroduced the New Deal for New Americans, one revision that they made to it was to increase it to $100 million, which is consistent with what our appropriations ask has been over the last few years. And if you'd like to participate in promoting the New Deal, I'm going to add a link into the chat box where folks can take from a digital toolkit with template posts and graphics. So if we could move to the next slide, just want to go over the appropriations priorities with a little bit more detail. So I mentioned previously that we were able to increase this USCIS Citizenship and Immigration Grant Program from 10 million to 25 million in the last 2 fiscal years. One benefit of that is that this grant program now doesn't just include citizenship, legal services, and English classes, but with that increase, Congress now funds a couple different new efforts that are part of that grant program. So there's now a Community and Regional Integration Network grant, which offers citizenship and integration services for humanitarian-based immigrants, like refugees, people who have asylum, Cuban or Haitian entrants, special immigrant visa holders, survivors of human trafficking or criminal activity, and people who receive protections under the Violence Against Women Act. The increase in funding has also led to funding for innovations in citizenship education program. And it's also led to funding for the Regional Hub program, which provides funding for regional or statewide legal services networks that offer direct citizenship legal services. MPNA became a recipient of this grant, and through it, it's able to offer sub-grants to legal services providers in Alabama, North Carolina, and Louisiana. So as part of this grant, we're able to provide grants and funding for legal representation for MPNA members in states or counties where they might not be able to get that public funding for legal representation. Through the USCIS backlog reduction efforts. So this is something that we've had some success, though not last year, in getting Congress to set funding for. As you know, the backlogs at USCIS is a serious issue. And Congress, through its funding of these efforts, have been able to assist USCIS is making limited progress on this issue, which include, backlogs of asylum applications, refugee processing, and immigration application processing backlogs for many different types of humanitarian-based immigrants. Then related to our third priority issue, legal representation for those who are facing deportation. For the last few years, we've requested $400 million for these efforts, and this would go to community-based organizations and other entities who could receive funds from the federal government to offer legal services and removal defense for people who are at risk of removal. This we view at the MPNA network as part of a sort of interim victory for our larger efforts to try to establish the right to counsel and have that be a federally funded service for anyone who's facing deportation. As part of these larger efforts that go beyond appropriations, we've been working very closely with the Vera Institute of Justice, and MPNA has been co-leading with them an effort called Fairness to Freedom, Campaign for Universal Representation, working closely with the offices of Senator Gillibrand and Senator Booker, as well as Congresswoman Torres, to draft a bill called the Fairness to Freedom Act, which we're expecting the leads to introduce later in April, which would establish the right to legal representation federally funded for anyone facing deportation who cannot afford it. And I will add a link if you as an organization would like to endorse or become a part of this campaign, the Fairness to Freedom campaign. And then ultimately, going back to appropriations, we have the request for increasing what is now the Shelter and Services grant program within FEMA for migrants and other, for asylum seekers and other migrants who are arriving after being in contact or being released from DHS. So those are our priorities for MPNA for fiscal year 2024. And we'll invite, just going to the next slide, anyone who's interested in working on this with us to shoot me an email, Diego@partnership.for-newamericans.org. As I mentioned, we are currently submitting all our different requests to congressional appropriators. Over the next few weeks and months, we're going to be reaching out to those offices, meeting with them, advocating for our requests, and invite you all to participate in that as we really need the voices of directly impacted people, refugee advocates, and close allies to be a part of this effort. We're in a very different political stage than where we were when I started this work for MPNA. And with the current control of the House of Republicans, are not just working to advance some of our priorities, but really defend some of the priorities and advances and victories that we've made over the last few years. So need all hands on deck, and encourage you all to reach out if you have any questions or comments or would like to be a part of these efforts. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Nada. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Diego, for that thorough background around appropriations for several pieces of legislation that need to move forward. Now I'm going to turn it over to Amy Fisher, who is the Advocacy Director with Amnesty International USA, and Meredith Owen, who is the Director of Policy with Church World Service. So they're going to talk a little bit more about the federal appropriations for fiscal year 2024 when it comes to refugee funding priorities. So Amy and Meredith, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And I am going to start by, on the next slide, talking through why it's important to advocate to members of Congress around robust funding for the refugee-related accounts. Diego talked through some of this, so I won't go through like every single point. But I wanted to flag that what Amy and I are going to talk through are the specific refugee-related accounts that fund the refugee protection and the refugee resettlement program. And so This is something that is incredibly important. As we know, the resettlement program has always been a public-private partnership. We've always had support from communities and volunteers to buttress the resettlement program. But it is congressional investments that are the public portion of the public-private partnership, and are the resources that can really scale up best practices and meet at minimum basic needs, but also thinking about other integration services that we are advocating for. And so it's incredibly important that all community members around the country meet with their members of Congress to push for robust funding for these accounts. It's particularly important to meet with members who are in charge of writing the budget. If you've done legislative visits, you've probably heard us say this, but the Senate Appropriations Committee and the House Appropriations Committee are in charge of writing the federal budget. And within the appropriations committees, they group together different federal agencies, and they refer to those as subcommittees. And so on these slides, you'll see that we have three major sets of funding asks. One is to fund the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration for its Refugee Protection and Resettlement Program. We asked for funding for the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. Those are all the services like job training, English language classes, etc. And we asked for funding for the Department of Homeland Security's USCIS humanitarian portfolio. So think refugee and asylum processing. So with that, we can go to the next slide, and I will give the floor to Amy to talk through ORR priorities.
Thanks, Meredith, and hi all. So happy to be with you all today. So within the ORR priorities, we have a lot. And so we have them broken up across a few different slides. And so this first slide is really digging into the areas of the appropriations that we are asking for that really dig in specifically to resettlement support. And so what you will see is we have a few different buckets here. First and foremost is the transitional and medical services. And that is the stuff that, is through, matching grant programs that supports with case management and employee trainings and job referrals and budget planning, and then also helping with some like basic needs like housing, food, transport, things that are going to help refugees as they are really trying to put down roots in their communities, working through the same model of public-private partnership to make sure that refugees and other beneficiaries can really become self-sufficient once they start landing in their new communities. We're also advocating for refugee and support services, specifically in that bucket. So we're looking for, 1.65 billion in the transitional medical services, and then 950 million in the refugee and support services. And those pieces, the refugee and support services, are additionally supporting with integration, employment, and health programs to help those that are arriving. We're also looking for funding for both supporting the Afghans and Ukrainians. So I think, as many of you all know, there are the Afghans and Ukrainians that have come to the U.S. in parole programs that would not otherwise be eligible for these services because they didn't come through the regular refugee resettlement program that you all are so familiar with. And so I think it's important to just name that both in the transitional and medical services buckets, as well as the refugee support services buckets, that includes those ongoing services for Ukrainians and Afghans. if we can go to the next slide. That gives a little bit more information about specifically like the digging into the different programs I already spoke to, both within the traditional, transitional, and medical services buckets, as well as the refugee and support services. And so again, those are really the numbers that we are looking for to ensure that those that are arriving via like the regular resettlement programs, as well as Afghans, as well as Ukrainians, can have access to those critical supports so that they can get what they need to put down roots in their new communities. In the next slide, you will see the numbers that we are asking for in the like other programs that live within the ORR sub bucket. So if we can go to that next slide, where what we see is the anti-trafficking in persons program, which includes the trafficking victims assistance program. And this year we're asking for 50 million there. And these are programs for foreign nationals as well as US citizens to be supported and get the like after trafficking supports that they need. We're seeking 28 million for survivors of torture programs to fund NGOs that are providing services to torture survivors and their families. 8 billion for unaccompanied children, and that is for unaccompanied kiddos who are in the care and custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and ORR provides shelter and care for those that are in its custody, and this also includes funding for post-release services, and you'll see in a minute one of the things that we are asking for is expanded post-release services. And so that $8 billion number includes sort of both of those buckets. The one, obviously, like for the care and custody of the kiddos that are within ORR custody, and then ensuring that there are continued supports once kiddos are out of ORR custody. And then we have some new exciting funding around mental health services to really dig in and provide mental health services for ORR eligible populations. And then there is a really critical contingency fund, you know, so that the agency does have the ability to really, you know, respond to emergencies and respond to oncoming situations in which they may not have budgeted for. But of course, we always ask for that 500 million to come with critical, you know, oversight to make sure that those funds are being used appropriately. So let's dig into, so if we can go to the next slide, we can dig a little bit into one sort of like the total numbers that we're asking for. So within ORR, we're asking for a lot. So the total request for fiscal year 2024 is, you know, a little over 11 billion. And we have a really handy dandy, very in the weeds document where we dig into report language. So the report language part is outside of the stuff that's like very like crunchy numbers, but you know, we oftentimes use the appropriations process to really direct both you know, oversight and ensure there is like reporting and public reporting in particular on the ways in which funding is being used, but also so that the agencies can sometimes do studies or expand programs and things like that. And so that's really what we're going to speak to now. So one, as I already talked about this like mental health stuff. And so within the increased funding that we are asking for around mental health services for eligible populations, we also are asking for report language to encourage the ORR to do a study on the mental health needs of individuals that are, you know, starting to put down roots in their communities and what is needed, because it's something that previously has not really been considered, and it's such a big need. And I know all of you know why that is so critical. We also have some new oversight asks related to expanding housing and legal assistance, prioritizing community-based residential care facilities for unaccompanied children. So instead of housing unaccompanied children that are in the care of ORR, instead of housing them in like massive facilities, prioritizing small community-based residential facilities. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, enhancing and expanding post-release services for unaccompanied children. And Basma, yeah, let's answer those at the end. And then we can go to the next slide. And here I'm going to be switching from, so we talked about how we have the different buckets of funding. So the prior stuff was in it's LHHS, which is like the Labor, Health, Human Services Appropriations bucket. Within that was the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now we're in a totally different bucket. So now we're talking Department of Homeland Security. And within the Department of Homeland Security, we are talking about U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. And so for the total for this, we are asking for $865 million. Which will boost processing for applications for humanitarian parole, adjustments of status, as well as making sure that there is, robust processing for refugees and asylum. We can go to the next slide. Within USCIS, in addition to the funding, we are also including critical oversight priorities. I think Diego already talked about, some of those that we had asked for years prior and are still included. Here I'm including some new priorities. But, I think we all have to kind of re-up the need for visa recapture. We are also asking for a restoration and implementation of the Cuban Haitian Entrant Program. We are asking for additional oversight related to refugee admissions and processing, and ensuring that the U.S. is continuing to sort of like restore, expand, and deepen our work on it in refugee processing, expanding and providing oversight over the Central American Minors Program, and over critical oversight for P3 processing. And Meredith, from there, I will pass to you to dig into our lovely PRM stuff.
Thank you so much. I know that this is a lot of information, and like you'll have all of these slides, so don't feel like you have to memorize everything like right as we're like talking through all of this. I am talking about our funding investment requests specifically for the State Department's operations of the resettlement program and providing overseas assistance. So we request funding for 3 separate accounts that support refugee and displacement assistance. The first one is the Migration and Refugee Assistance Account, which is funding that the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration administers. The second account that we advocate for is the Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance Account, or IRMA. That's also administered by the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And then the third one is the International Disaster Assistance Account, which is administered by USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. Now, I'll explain what these 3 accounts fund, but you can see here that we're asking for $5.2 billion for the Migration and Refugee Assistance Account, $5.27 billion for the International Disaster Assistance Account, and $2 billion for the Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance Account. And you will notice that these are numbers that in general are higher than what Congress typically provides, and what the administration has requested, with a couple exceptions from last year after the fall of Kabul. We are asking for FY 2024 the same amount of funding that we did back in FY 2023. And so you can see that although it's unlikely that we'll get everything we want in terms of the level of funding that we're asking for, that the scale and breadth of the global displacement crisis certainly merits higher funding levels. So you can go to the next slide. So the main account that is the biggest priority to advocate for in legislative visits is asking for $5.2 billion for the Migration and Refugee Assistance account, because it provides overseas assistance to refugees like shelter, food, water, etc. It is also the account that funds refugee processing through the U.S. resettlement program. And it's the account that provides funding for the domestic reception and placement grant. That is that per capita amount that is supposed to help refugees during their first 30 to 90 days in the United States. Now, as you know, the amount of money that is provided to the U.S. resettlement program, and especially for the reception and placement grants, does not always meet the need. And so that is a really concrete example as to why we need more funding for that account. It's also important in light of the unprecedented global displacement crisis and global refugee crisis that we have today. The Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance Account, or IRMA, it functions as a release valve for the administration to use in response to emergencies and emerging crises. So this is an account that the president has the authority to authorize the State Department to use when there is some kind of emergency where there needs to be like an immediate use of funding, where they can't tap into MRA funding. So we include a link here to a backgrounder that provides examples of how IRMA has been used in the past. Most recently, just a month ago, President Biden authorized the IRMA account to be used to respond to Turkey and Syria, and authorized $50 million to be drawn down from this account. So you can see how, during the fall of Kabul, in response to Turkey, Syria, but also throughout bipartisan administrations, they've used this account to help meet emerging needs. The last one is the International Disaster Assistance Account, which is an account that supports and serves internally displaced persons overseas. And the way that we typically refer to this account is it helps ensure that people don't become refugees in a third country. You can go to the next slide. So this slide offers a way that you can talk about the investments in the State Department and the resettlement program, and like how you can frame some of the remarks. So for example, in addition to storytelling and talking about personal experience working with refugees or as a former refugee, you can also talk about how the resettlement program supports U.S. national security and advances our foreign policy priorities. how it supports regional and global security, and particularly in some of the most challenging areas around the world. You can talk about how there are protracted refugee situations that persist and result in higher overseas refugee assistance needs. And, another important piece is thinking about the annual refugee admissions goal. So State Department funding assists refugees in their first 90 days after arrival. And the administration has set this year's refugee admissions goal at 125,000. And we understand that the FY 2024 admissions goal will also be set at 125,000. So robust funding will help ensure the US can meet that goal. Next slide, please. In addition to funding, Amy talked about how there can be accompanying oversight language that helps guide the direction or use of the federal funding. In that same report language oversight document, it includes priorities for how the State Department can use funds. So we are asking for some funding to be dedicated to refugee-led organizations to support the processing and protection of stateless individuals, for funding to be accompanied by mandatory reports from the administration to Congress around the refugee admissions program, around some of their backlogs, like around family reunification. This is also where we ask for additional visas. So every year, RCUSA asks for additional Afghan special immigrant visas for Afghans who assisted the US mission. And in FY24, we're asking for 25,000 visas. And we're also asking for the Lautenberg program to be included in the budget bill as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Amy to talk about how folks can take action and meet with their members of Congress. And you can go to this slide. Amy?
Thanks, Meredith. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of cheerleading now because, Meredith and I sort of got into some weeds and gave you some big numbers and things like this. But, what is really critical is that members of Congress are hearing these requests, not just from folks in DC like me and Meredith and Diego and folks like that, but that they're hearing it from those of you all that are in their districts and very much doing a lot of this work in the districts. And you can tell them why these requests are so critical to you and your communities and the work that you're doing and the communities that you're supporting and the communities that you are a part of. And so it is so critical for you all to set up meetings with your members of Congress to talk about what these asks are for fiscal year 24. It does not matter if your member of Congress is part of the Appropriations Committee, is part of a relevant committee, whether they're on the Judiciary Committee or anything like that. And I say that because every single member of Congress sends what their appropriations priorities are to the Appropriations Committee for consideration. And so your members of Congress right now are figuring out what is their number one priority for the Department of Homeland Security. What is their number one priority for, the State Department? What is their number one priority for the Office of Refugee Resettlement? All of these things. And it is your job to say, these are the things that should be your priorities because these are the things that are our priorities, right? And so, it is so critical for those meetings to happen. We also have here in the in the PowerPoint, which will be shared with you afterwards, some helpful talking points, because sometimes these meetings can be hard. They can be intimidating. You're getting into the wonk of things. So what we have done with like the number of Google Docs that are linked in here, with both like the explicit numbers and the explanations and now the talking points, is to really give you the tools that you need to have these meetings. One of the other ways in which members of Congress are able to advocate for the issues and the funding levels that they want are through what are called Dear Colleague letters, which are letters that they are sending to the appropriations committees to say, we really want the appropriations committee to fund X number on X program or X priority. And there was a House Dear Colleague to the Appropriations Committee that was led by Congressman Vargas, which closed last week. And we are expecting a Dear Colleague on the Senate side to come out shortly that will be led by Senator Blumenthal. And those are things that, your member of Congress can sign on to those letters. If you are meeting with your member of Congress on the House side that was not on that Dear Colleague letter, you can ask them to make sure that they are prioritizing these things in the portal, or finding other ways to communicate to the Appropriations Committee about what their priorities are. And then there definitely is still an opportunity in the Senate to sign on that Dear Colleague letter on these priorities once it is out. And that is it, and we'll pass it back.
Thank you so much, Amy and Meredith, for providing us with a detailed update on appropriations for refugee funding and ways people can take action. Next, we're going to turn it over to Sarah Senyuk with RCUSA, Refugee Council USA, who's going to talk about upcoming Refugee Advocacy Days. So Sarah, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Neda. We can go to the first slide, Andres. Awesome. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Sarah Senyuk. My pronouns are they, she, and I serve as the Director of Advocacy and Communications for Refugee Council USA. And we are on the final countdown to our 2023 National Advocacy Days. RCUSA has been helping to organize a National Advocacy Day since 2019, and this will be our first return in person since the start of the pandemic in 2020. So we're very excited to bring everyone to Washington, D.C. You may have participated in one of our virtual advocacy days over the last few years. It is related, but being in person, there will be a whole new aspect of getting to do in-person trainings, as well as actually getting the personal experience of meeting with members of Congress and getting to know other advocates and community members from across the U.S. So a little bit about our National Advocacy Days. They're going to be taking place May 1st through 3rd. So it is just around the corner. Our goal this year is to bring together at least 350 community members and advocates from across the country, and to have at least 1/3 of those participants with lived experience of forced displacement. We will be scheduling over 200 meetings with congressional offices, and beyond those meetings, there will also be special trainings, panel discussions, press opportunities, and chances to connect with advocates from across the country. I will also say that this really is for folks with any sort of experience level when it comes to doing direct advocacy work. The RCUSA Coalition is really fortunate to have amazing experts from across the field who will be lending their knowledge in providing trainings ahead of time to make sure that all of our participants feel prepared and comfortable to take meetings with members of Congress. Each meeting delegation will be accompanied by a representative from the RCUSA coalition to be there for moral support and to help kind of backstop some of the policy asks. So we really encourage everyone to apply. The link that you can apply at is bit.ly/refugee advocacy with capital R and A for that. There is a extra opportunity for participants with lived experience. Andres, can we go to the next slide? Awesome. So on May 1st, ahead of the meetings with members of Congress, RCUSA, We Are All America, and Refugee Congress are going to be convening a day-long special training session for participants with lived experience with forced displacement. We'll be going into kind of deep dives on US government, revisiting some of these appropriations asks, getting to have more kind of mock practice with these sort of like meetings, storytelling workshops. So it's going to be a really great experience. Also, RCUSA is going to be able to offer scholarships to participants with lived experience if they're not able to get their job to help cover the cost, or are unable to cover the cost themselves. So we are doing our best to make sure that the cost of travel is not a deterrent for folks being able to participate. I'll say that there is no registration fee to participate in advocacy days. Folks are just needing to cover their cost of transportation and hotels. RCUSA has blocks of hotels for everyone. All of that information is shared upon registration. So that's kind of the nitty-gritty of the convening itself. I'll chat a little bit about what our policy asks are going to be. Andres, if we can do the next slide. Thank you. So if you have participated in an RCUSA advocacy days previously, we have traditionally sought to have our asks of congressional offices to really reflect the breadth of the communities that are represented by RCUSA's member organizations. This year, in order to accomplish that goal, we're going to be making some kind of higher level asks. And what's really important here is how those higher level asks are brought to life. Kind of doing a callback to what Amy said about the importance of scheduling the meetings with members of Congress on appropriations. It's really important in these meetings for the offices to understand the personal lived components of these policy asks. They're used to hearing from us DC advocates all the time. And so again, getting to speak with their constituents from their districts has a really significant impact. And so again, we work with We Are All America and Refugee Congress and other RCUSA partners to help our participants communicate these policy asks in a way that is rooted in their own lived experience. So our policy asks this year are going to be to support permanent protections for forcibly displaced people. An example is the overuse of humanitarian parole that we've seen over the last year and a half, in the ways that folks are going to be sort of left in the lurch when it comes to needing to access ongoing support, and needing to recognize and support pathways to documentation for stateless people. This also includes supporting our asylum and resettlement programs generally. Second is going to be support robust funding for humanitarian protection programs. So calling back to what Diego, Amy, and Meredith all shared with the appropriations. And then finally, support positive legislation toward rebuilding resettlement, asylum, and protecting all forcibly displaced populations. And while we won't necessarily be doing formal endorsements of particular pieces of legislation, some examples of the legislation that we see as really positive are the Afghan Adjustment Act, the Refugee Protection Act, and the GRACE Act. And then next slide. Awesome. So yeah, this is just final call that registration is going to be open until April 10th. You can find out more about advocacy days in total with our concept note by heading over to the RCUSA website, or you can register directly through the bit.ly link. And I'll hand things back to Neda.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to all of our speakers for providing this important information. We have a few minutes and wanted to open it up to everyone here for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll open up the webinar for you to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat box. Now is the time. And we do have a question in the Q&A box in regards to immigration organizations seem to focus on immigration reform rather than also supporting programs and ideas that would advance their lives of immigrants while living in the U.S., such as robust social programs like universal health care, affordable housing. The work around immigration reform is so important, but I also think the advocating for other universal services is part of and parcel for advocating for more humane lives. Does anyone want to, any of the panelists want to address this question?
I could give it a shot. I personally don't know of any organizations that focus solely on immigration reform through legislation creating a path to citizenship, but I know that a lot of organizations focus a lot on that, and I think it's necessary given the urgency for it, given the millions of undocumented people who are subject or could be subject to detention and deportation, and the rife amount of human rights and due process violations there, and just wanting to keep families together or have people who have been separated for long times be reunited. But I absolutely agree with like the spirit of that question. Even if don't necessarily agree with the premise of it, and would just emphasize that there's a lot of different organizations, including in the NPA network, that focus on a path to citizenship, but then also some of the programs expanding access to healthcare for undocumented people, childcare proposals, especially on the state and local level, and that work very much so complements their fight for a path to citizenship and permanent residency. And MPNA through appropriations and elsewhere has focused on some of the programs targeting the inclusion of immigrants and refugees, including through workforce, English, strengthening the refugee resettlement to offer refugees more services as they're adjusting to their lives here, and view it as very much so complementary to the path to citizenship through legislation.
Thank you, Diego. Do other folks have any questions? Okay, if not, we are going to go ahead and wrap up our webinar for today. I want to thank all of our speakers for their time and all the amazing information they shared. Thank you everyone also who joined. We will send a follow-up with you all with a recorded recording of this webinar and the slide deck. Thank you everyone, and this concludes our webinar.